Greetings, welcome back. We last spoke in the voice of King Channel TV. We now invite you to BNN, Black National Network. BNN provides insight into and information from all of Black America. As we self-identify, delineate, and break away from those seeking to divide and bring perpetual loss to us, we see something unexpectedly unique unfolding among the nations of the earth. The nations are embracing a conversation. That conversation is the transatlantic slave trade, whose path is outlined in the background map of this video. They have chosen this day in history to call it a staggering crime.
Today we commemorate the victims of a staggering crime. Millions of people stolen from their families and communities in Africa, trafficked across the Atlantic, and if they survived the journey, enslaved in the Americas. Millions more were born into bondage, brutally exploited for their labor, and denied their basic humanity. We honor their quiet resilience and courageous acts of open resistance. This global order prevailed for over 400 years and haunts our world even now. In systems and institutions shaped and enriched by chattel slavery, in social and economic inequalities rooted in past injustices, and in biases that permeate our culture and impact us all. On this International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, we are called to confront these legacies. By rejecting the false narrative of racial difference and the ugly lie of white supremacy, by dismantling racism online, in the media, in schools, at work, in politics, and within ourselves, and by working for truth, justice, and repair. I welcome the initial steps by some governments to address the consequences of slavery, but far bolder actions by many more member states are needed, including commitments to respect African countries' ownership of their own resources, and steps to ensure their equal participation and influence in the global financial architecture and the UN Security Council. Together, let us commit to a world where all people live and thrive in dignity.
The United Nations chief just made a bold request of all the nations. He requested that they bring about a possible healing to this staggering crime. Can this be accomplished? It appears as if all nations have been our house of bondage. He calls this crime a global order that lasted over 400 years and that still haunts our world today. So then what will be the healing? Tell me, can the nations who captured and sold us undo the captivity? Can the nations who bought, removed, and scattered us across the earth put back what they took? The triangle trade was a three-legged economic model and a trade route that was predicated on the transatlantic trade of enslaved people. It flourished from the 16th to the 19th century, about 400 years, during the era of Western colonialism. This was prophesied in Genesis 15:13. The three markets conducting this trade were Europe, Western Africa, and the New World, the Americas. The majority of the people taken captive were women in their childbearing years and young men who normally would be starting families. This too was prophesied in Joel 3:3. We will look deeper into the nations who formed this inhuman partnership that committed such grievous acts against other human beings. Why did they do it? What did they want? The Africans and the Europeans. During the era of the transatlantic slave trade, Europeans did not have the power to invade African states and kidnap Africans for enslavement. The capture and sale of over 20 million people for enslavement was done so by African merchant traders. The trade began when the Portuguese interests in Africa moved away from deposits of gold to a much more readily available commodity, enslaved people. The Europeans sought to expand their empires in the New World, but they lacked a suitable workforce. The indigenous people had proven to be unreliable, as most of them were dying from diseases brought over from Europe. And Europeans were unsuited to the climate and suffered under tropical diseases. Africans, on the other hand, were excellent workers. They had the experience of agriculture and keeping cattle. They were used to a tropical climate, resistant to tropical diseases, and they could be worked very hard on plantations or in mines. Many Westerners wonder why the Africans would kidnap and sell their own people to the Europeans. The simple answer is that the Africans did not see enslaved people as their own people. Blackness, as an identity or marker of difference, was at that time a preoccupation of Europeans, not Africans. African traders felt no obligation to protect enslaved Africans because they did not regard them as their equals in identity and status. Many sought wealth and power through the trade of enslaved people. Some African states resisted the slave trade, but economic and political pressures often made avoiding it difficult. Now let's look at the African kingdoms that thrived on the transatlantic slave trade. These played a major role in the capture, sale, and transport of enslaved people. They benefited economically from the trade, but at a great cost to their surrounding communities, resulting in the loss of countless lives and the disruption of societies. First, the Oyo Empire, Yoruba, today's Nigeria. The Oyo Empire sold captives, acquired mainly during intertribal warfare. These captives became valuable commodities for both local and European slave traders. As the demand for slaves in the Americas and Europe grew, and Oyo's wealth increased, so did its leaders' political options. They amassed great wealth and territorial expansion. We will provide further information into these adventures by the Oyo Empire and the lineage of the enslaved captives in an upcoming video. When the kingdom of Oyo began to collapse somewhere between 1817 to 1836, it is estimated that 121,000 people were transported to coastal ports via complex trade networks, loaded onto slave ships, and shipped to the Americas. The Yeki Kingdom, today's Democratic Republic of Congo. It existed from approximately 1856 to 1891. During this time, it was the most dominant power in South Central Africa. The kingdom controlled a vast territory encompassing around 500,000 square kilometers and held authority over the sole trade route connecting the east and west of the continent. The Yeki Kingdom's power was attributed to its control of valuable natural resources and the use of military force. Misiri, the kingdom's ruler, engaged in the trade of copper, slaves, and ivory in exchange for gunpowder and firearms. This allowed him to consolidate his power and expand his influence in the region. However, the kingdom fell when Belgium's King Leopold's Stairs expedition claimed it during the era of the Scramble for Africa. From 1865 to 1909, he became the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State. Next is the Ashanti Kingdom, present-day Ghana. Ashanti was one of the most powerful and influential West African states during the transatlantic slave trade era. Although the Ashanti people fiercely resisted European colonization, they actively engaged in the slave trade. They captured and sold individuals whom they saw as social outcasts, prisoners of war, and criminals to the European slave traders in exchange for firearms, luxury goods, and other valuable commodities. The Ashanti's involvement in the trade was driven by economic incentives, political considerations, and the desire to strengthen their own power. In 2006, Ghana apologized to the descendants of enslaved Africans for the role the Ashantis had played in the transatlantic slave trade. Perhaps the cruelest of these African kingdoms was the West African Kingdom of Dahomey. It was located in present-day Republic of Benin and existed from approximately 1600 until 1904. Developed in the early 17th century, it became a regional power in the 18th century at the height of the Middle Passage. Dahomey expanded south to conquer key cities like Alada and Ouida, aka Judah. Ouida belonged to the Kingdom of Ouida on the Atlantic coast. Dahomey had an organized domestic economy built on conquest, slave labor, significant international trade, diplomatic relations with Europeans, and an organized military. Notable was its all-female military unit called the Dahomey Amazons, the elaborate religious practices of Vodun, and a history of large-scale human sacrifices using slaves. Men, women, and children, captured by Dahomey in wars and slave raids, were sold to European slave traders in exchange for various goods, such as rifles, gunpowder, textiles, and alcohol. Dahomey used magical rituals during slave trading. Prior to being sold to Europeans, slaves were forced to march in circles around the tree of forgetfulness, so they would lose memories of their culture, family, and homeland. The purpose of this ritual was to prevent the spirits of deceased slaves from returning and seeking revenge against the royalty of Dahomey. Dahomey was historically referred to by Europeans as the Slave Coast. In the 1840s, the kingdom began to decline due to British pressure to abolish the slave trade. Dahomey exported more than 1 million Africans to the United States, the Caribbean, and Brazil before closing its trade in the 1860s. Here we must note that this captivity and shipment of slaves to the Americas by Dahomey is prophesied in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 68. In the year 2000, Benin issued an official apology to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States, acknowledging and expressing remorse for the country's historical involvement in the slave trade. So there it is. The nations have had a conversation. On March 25, 2026, the UN passed a resolution condemning the transatlantic slave trade, declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and their racialized chattel enslavement as the gravest crime against humanity. In this conversation, those who provided the goods, human life, for the gravest crime against humanity are asking for admittance by others and financial repairs to them for the enslaved people they captured and sold. We would love to hear from you, our subscribers, and all those watching the video. Thank you. Please subscribe to our network of informative channels and participate in the conversations. Peace.